So once again, I would like to introduce Dr. Suzanna Crage with her lecture today on categorizing people by race and exercising confusion and power. Dr. Crage.
Hello, I thank you for that intro, and good to see you here. So I committed to doing this lecture and to the topic that I was going to talk about at the end of May. And then pretty much, 2 or 3 days later, some things started happening that were really relevant. And I realized, wow, what timing for this topic, because suddenly it's much more relevant, except I need to correct that. It's not more relevant, it's more visibly relevant, because of course race has always been relevant for all of us, whether we recognize that or seen that in our lives or not. So I'm going to get to categorizing people by race, but first I want to do some basic definitions. What is race? I'm going to start by saying race doesn't exist. There's no biological basis for categorizing people by race. And I'm talking as a sociologist today, not a biologist, so I won't get into the details of this, but there are lots of resources out there. Scientific American and Science Magazine both have some really good articles about it that are kind of accessible to everyone. Now, the problem is, as a sociologist, I understand that this statement about race actually doesn't really work, because clearly race does exist. So, I mean, we know this, we live it. So how do we explain this? And one way of explaining this is by talking about the Thomas theorem. And this was come up with by kind of a power couple in sociology in the 1920s. And what they said is, if people perceive or define something as being real, then it's real in its consequences. That is, if we believe that something is real and we act on it, it might as well be real in terms of our lives. So what we can say about race is it doesn't exist, but it also does exist because we believe it does and act on it. This is something that we call socially constructed in sociology. It's neither natural nor is it artificial, it's social. People decided there are categories and given meaning to them and used them. And in fact, this social construction process of race has worked so well, we often see race as being natural and biological. So if race isn't biological, then what is it? This is how sociologists define race. It's a socially constructed, remember I just talked about that, a socially constructed way of grouping people that makes biological claims about differences and similarities among humans, and is used to make claims about moral, intellectual, and social attributes or abilities. So we use it to make claims, it makes claims, and we use it to make more claims. Another way of putting it is the very concept of race is based on racist ideas. We can't really talk about race without racism. Today I'm going to focus on really delving into what race is and how we think about different people and categories. But racism is inherent in all of this, is part of all of this. And to really understand racism, we need to understand race and how we apply it to different people. Now, the idea that race exists and that people can be broken up into different groups and have different identities, that there are meanings attached to these, this isn't static. This isn't something that's constant. And I'll show you examples today about how racial categories have changed over time and how the ways that what we use to categorize people has changed. Because it's not constant, it's actually a process. It's what we call a social process of racialization, constantly constructing these meanings, reiterating that race exists. And this happens every time we see new pictures depicting white people who are being arrested versus Black people who are being arrested. These carry meanings about different racial categories and what's associated with them. And actually seeing this tweet got me curious. So I went to Shutterstock, which is one of those stock image websites, and I put in Black man arrested images, and this is what I got. And then I put in white man arrested images, and I looked through this, and even in the white man arrested images, about a third of the pictures were of Black men, which I thought kind of said something about the social meanings that are put out there about race right now. So this process of racialization, I'm going to talk about some of the things it's based on. It's based on history and politics, and the big thing is power. Okay, so after all of this, why not just say, okay, you know what, race isn't biological, it's this thing we've made up. Why not just say we shouldn't judge people based purely on physical appearance? Let's not pay attention to race. The problem, of course, is that it's deeper than that. And one of the ways that some groups and people are more racialized than others. And what I mean by that is they're more likely to be thought of in terms of their perceived race. Their actions and beliefs and values are more likely to be perceived as coming out of their racial identity and interpreted as being part of what it means to be the race that they're part of. So here's just a really basic example. If I draw a stick figure, most North Americans looking at this are explicitly or implicitly going to see a white man. This is the default human being, especially in North America and Europe, but in a lot of other places as well. If I wanted to show women, I'd probably draw long hair or a dress. Maybe if I wanted to show somebody who's Black, I would have to add kinky hair or brown skin. I'd have to mark somebody to show that they aren't white. This is to show that they're different, to show that what we sometimes call others. You might have heard the term recently, othering, or others. Some people are starting to use it in the news. And it's the idea when there are groups that are defined by stereotypes or generalities, or basically just defined by being in contrast with the in-group. And in a lot of societies, white people are the in-group. They're the default, the thing you assume, and everybody else, they have kind of specific characteristics associated with them, and you have to specify that it's somebody else. I can't tell you how many books I've read where there are characters that are being introduced and they're talking and, oh, this guy and this girl and this Black man and this Asian woman, and the white man and the white girl never have white in front of them. It's another example of how not being white is racialized. It's being marked as having a racial identity in a way that white people aren't explicitly. Here's one more example of this from The Simpsons. Looking at this, okay, I'll admit I've watched maybe 2 episodes of The Simpsons, and I know people love it, fine. But one thing that I always wondered is, why do people assume Marge Simpson is white? I mean, her skin is yellow, her hair is a blue afro. It's, of course, because the default human being thing is so strong that lacking any other clear stereotype signs of being either Black or Asian, she defaults to white. So, okay, those are a couple of basic definitions. What is race? What is race not? And it is not a biological entity. It is a social, not only something that's socially constructed, but it's a process. We're always deciding who belongs to what category, what the categories are, and what those categories mean. Which it gets us back to the title of the talk, Categorizing People by Race, this exercise in confusion and power. And I'm going to give away the big message. Not only is the concept of race socially constructed, but the categorizations are also socially constructed. That might not be a surprise by now. And also they often involve struggles for power, because again, race isn't neutral and it doesn't affect everybody in the same way. So I'm gonna start by asking you a question just to think about right now, and I'll tell you my answer later on. But here are the 3 things to think about as you kind of go through this. First, what is your race? What race do you identify with? And how do you know what your race is? What attributes decide that? When did you find that out? Or do you remember ever finding that out? When I ask this in my intro class, I get a lot of different answers, and often it varies depending on people's answer to the first question. So I'll let you keep thinking about that while I go to talking about, okay, so go ahead and type into the chat, and Bettina's gonna keep track of it. Who here knows who Kim Kardashian is? And if you don't know who Kim Kardashian is, go ahead and type in a no. But if you know who she is, type in a yes. Who here knows who Kim Kardashian is? I just wanna know if I need to talk about Kim Kardashian.
Overwhelming yes.
Okay.
But we do also have another question, in fact, that comes in and asking what factors make white the default, even in places where the majority population isn't white. Can you answer that now, or would you like to wait until the discussion?
You know what? I will answer that now because it's, you know what? I will wait to the discussion, but keep that for this. And that's a really good question, and probably more than I should talk about now. Okay, so Kim Kardashian. We all know who she is. The question is, do we know what her race is? And I'll tell you, there are a lot of people who don't. If we go to the internet, I just put in Kim Kardashian, what race? And this is a Reddit, is Kim Kardashian white? On the internet, people have no idea what to do with her and racial classification. Maybe she's classified as white, but no white person sees her as white, if you know what I mean. Like Taylor Lautner or Demi Lovato. And it just goes on and on. You know, here's somebody saying, oh, she's totally white, because, and they start talking genetically, we're 32 to 40% Indo-European, blonde and brunette Armenians. Many of you are come from Armenia and the Caucasus. Middle Eastern is considered Caucasian, but the threshold for defining white varies depending on who you ask. You know, the very limits of white. They're really working hard to try and figure out who is white and who's not white. And then we have people who say, well, she's obviously not fully white. No one even thought that she was white when they first see her. Armenians are mixed with many different things. And then, you know, she's Armenian, I think that's between Europe and the Middle East. And that person wasn't even really sure what to do with that, but they thought, you know, that's relevant somehow. So on the internet, nobody knows. They know that one of her parents is Armenian, or at least comes from Armenia, or there's Armenian background, and that might matter somehow. So I thought, okay, let's ask governments. Are Armenians white? In Canada, well, these are the classifications from Statistics Canada. This is the organization that does the census and gets us information about Canadians. And they classify Armenians as Arab or West Asian. And those are not in the category of white. So in Canada, she's not white, but she lives in the US. So in the US, actually Armenians are considered to be European, who are considered to be Caucasian, she's in the US, she's white. So before I go on and talk about why that difference is, I should note that while Canada sees 11 racial categories, as you can see there with the 12 of other racial and ethnic category, the US sees 5. So just another little note about how racial categories are really socially constructed. And part of what's going on is politics. Really different categories, just two countries right next to each other. But at the same time, we can say, oh, look, Canada has all these extra categories, yay for us, or boo for us, I'm not sure which. But in the end, the laws in Canada that deal with race and ethnicity and discrimination and the like really break down into pretty much 3 categories: white, visible minority, and Aboriginal or Indigenous. So in the end, it comes back to even fewer categories in practice than in the US. You're either white, or you're a visible minority, or you're Indigenous. And I should say, this is what Statistics Canada does. And it's actually kind of fun, I think, to go to the website of Statistics Canada and look up racial classifications or ethnic identities, because they have this big long page talking about these categories. And the big long page is basically saying, we don't think that these categories are actually meaningful. Racial identification, racial classifications aren't really biological. They're based on everything I just talked about, but we have to do this because the law says we do. So even Statistics Canada, as they're making these categories, they know that something is up with this, and it's a little iffy. So why do we care if Kim Kardashian is considered to be white or not? We care because racial classification has to do with power. One way that it matters is social status. And we're gonna see some, talk about some ideas that I don't find particularly pleasant. This is one of them. This was posted right around the time that Kim Kardashian was dating Kanye West, kind of at his height. There are very few ways that people would consider Kanye West to be below Kim Kardashian's league. And the only way this person was clearly drawing on was racial differences. So there's a whole lot more to say about that. But I will also say that it matters formally as well, not just socially, for legal rights. So in the US, for instance, in 1790, This was the first time the US Congress met after the US Constitution was approved, and they had to decide who can become a US citizen. And as you can see on there, it said only free white people, they decided, could become US citizens. As a note, this also excluded women because they were considered to be dependents of their husbands or fathers or brothers, so they also mostly weren't free. So this was from 1790 and kind of went on. But then in the years after the US Civil War, and starting 1890s, 1900s, there were a series of cases that went to courts because there were US residents who were applying for citizenship. And basically, the courts were asked to decide whether they were white because they were being denied citizenship because the government was saying they weren't white. So in 1909, the government opposed naturalization or becoming a citizen for 4 Armenians because they said the Armenians weren't free white people. I know I just said earlier that in the US, Kim Kardashian is white because she's Armenian, but at the time they weren't white. So because at the time Armenians were Asiatic was what they said. And so they said that's not white. Now what happened though was in 1909, the court disagreed and the court said, actually, no, they can have citizenship. Yay, except for let's look at the court's reasons. This is really useful for thinking about what we use to categorize people by race. So they said that race, there's no easy working test for what is white versus color, and these are the words they were using. And so they said that the eligibility for citizenship, and therefore for being white, is based on ideals, standards, and aspirations. And I'm just going to read you some. They went into deep history, and I love it. I'll just read you some excerpts. In the warfare, which has raged since the beginning of history around the Eastern Mediterranean between Europeans and Asiatics, the Armenians have generally, though not always, been found on the European side. By reason of their Christianity, they generally range themselves against the Persian fire worshippers. They talk all sorts of stereotypes here. But then they say, wait, there's a problem. So they were Christian. Yay, that makes them somehow more likely to be white. But they were part of the Eastern Church. They weren't part of Western Protestantism. So the judge went on and talked about how there was the Council of Chalcedon when Eastern and Western Catholicism split. I meant to look up when it was, but it was a very long time ago. And they said that war and their remoteness, well, the judge said they were said to have prevented the Armenian bishops from attending that council in the 5th century. Thus, they say they were misled as the pronouncement of the council, and so a schism arose without heresy on their part. That is, basically, the Armenians went with the Eastern Church, but that's because they weren't actually at the council, so they didn't really understand. And so it's not their fault that they were part of the Eastern Church. And therefore, they have generally manifested a sympathy with Europe. And plus, the judge said, Armenians have an ability to become westernized and readily adaptable to European standards. And so he said they could become citizens. They could be white and become citizens. So in other words, being white, which in this case meant having a say in democracy by voting and all the other rights of citizenship, wasn't about race as we often think about it. Being white was about these ideas and standards and aspirations. It was about religion and adaptability. Not really how it's usually thought of today. I'll give you one more example. This was another case, John Muhammad Ali from India, and he arrived to the US in 1900 and had a large business, he importing tea and cocoa. And in 1921, he wanted to become a citizen. And a local court in Michigan said that notwithstanding his dark complexion, he was a high caste Hindu and therefore a white person, so eligible for citizenship. So there we can see color didn't matter, class did. He was high class, he was high caste. Problem is, 2 years later, the Supreme Court in the US made a decision saying Indians weren't white. And so in Michigan, the US attorney filed to take away his citizenship, saying he became a US citizen illegally because, again, he wasn't a free white person. And at this time, he said his skin was unmistakably dark, like other members of his race. So suddenly, even though having dark skin earlier didn't matter, it mattered now. And eventually it went to court again, and 2 years later, the judge said his skin is certainly not white, but unmistakably dark. It would seem that the most that could be claimed by him would be membership in the Caucasian race. which incidentally at that time meant not white. So he lost his citizenship. If you're confused by that story, that's totally fine, because what we saw right at the beginning, his dark complexion doesn't matter, but then it does, but then it doesn't, and then because he's Caucasian, he's not white, which, so again, this is where the confusion comes in. Categorizing people by race has not been a consistent process, and it just emphasizes the way that race is socially constructed. I should say that these race-based limits to becoming a US citizen were only lifted in 1952. Now, Canada never had limits by race on who could become a citizen, at least not explicitly, but it did have restrictions on who could immigrate to Canada. So practically it had restrictions on who could become a citizen because for many decades, it really preferred people that the government considered to be white as immigrants. Okay, so after all that, let me just go back briefly to this question and my answer, thinking about this, you know, all this confusion, honestly, it was never part of my life. Because really, I'm white. How do I know I'm white? My mom's white. She's Austrian. Austrians are white. My dad's white because I kind of always knew. I don't know. I don't remember learning about this. And this, one of the reasons why is it's kind of, again, white was always the default for me. It was never a question. Nobody ever asked me what race I was. This isn't always the case for people who have white parents. I want to show you some examples of some people hanging out with their white parents. So here we have Alicia Keys. She recently hosted the Grammys, I think last year. Halle Berry, you might recognize her as an actor. You might know who Beyonce is. And of course, there's little Barack Obama. Obviously, these are also people with white parents, but they aren't people we think of as white. And I'll just ask, and you can type a yes if you think you know. Does anybody know why these people, why we think of them as Black? Actually, I'll ask, has anybody heard of the one-drop rule? Are you getting any yeses?
But perhaps a little bit more hesitantly.
Okay.
A no, too.
Okay, so let's talk about the one-drop rule. This is to say it's a rule. It's been part of some laws, but it's been much more influential than the laws it was part of. This, I'll give you one example of a law that enacted the one-drop rule. And this is from the state of Virginia historically. They said it shall hereafter be unlawful for any white person in this state to marry any blah blah, to marry anyone save a white person, and then they define the term white person. It shall apply only to such person as has no trace whatever of any blood other than Caucasian. Again, at this point, Caucasian again means white. So here it's based on this idea that there's, of course, race is somehow in the blood. And they're saying you can only be white if you have no trace. So even one drop means you can't be white. This one drop rule really was especially prevalent in the US, but it's had a huge influence, especially in thinking about how we categorize people as Black. And I'll talk about why in a moment, but first I want to point out another bit of this. Right before the earlier quote, there's a bit of an exception in there. Shall marry any save a white person or a person with no other mixture of blood than white and American Indian. Why are American Indians or Native Americans or indigenous people, why can white people marry them? Or why can they marry white people is really the more important question. Well, this actually, the original law, when it was first proposed in 1922, I think it was, it didn't have that exception. It said white people could only marry white people. There's a problem. You might have heard of Pocahontas, right? There was a Disney movie about Pocahontas. She was the nice Native American who helped we didn't call them settlers, we called them adventurers and explorers, right? Go through North America. She was cool. She was popular. People liked her. And many of Virginia's most prominent families claimed to be descended from Pocahontas because she was cool. Probably more than could have been descended from her, to be honest. And so if they passed this law as it was originally written, suddenly all those people who claimed to be descended from Pocahontas couldn't marry white people. And they would have basically made a lot of prevalent families in the state no longer white. And so instead, they put in what has been called the Pocahontas exception. Virginians could be up to 1/16 Native American and still be white in the eyes of the law. And this is a really clear example of how when powerful people think of themselves as white, the definition of whiteness actually changes. Now, one-drop laws haven't been in effect for a long time, certainly legally, though again, it still really influences the way we think about race. But ideas of separation, well, I should say, what was this about, actually? And let me make that really clear in case you hadn't gotten it by now. What these laws are about in the idea of the one-drop rule was frankly about keeping Black people separate from white people. It came from slavery, keeping these people who had been slaves, who were seen as, you know, we all know how they were seen. They were seen as worse in all sorts of ways, as inferior, and keeping them separate, but also fears of contamination. Black people were seen as impure. White people were seen as pure, but not immune to contamination. So this was about separating white people out and keeping them pure. And these fears and ideas aren't entirely gone. So here's two more questions. One, did anybody here see Beyonce's 2016 Super Bowl performance? Are you getting many yeses or nos? And actually, while we're at it,
yes, but also a couple of no's. So it's, I would say right now from those who are responding, it's perhaps a mix.
How about her formation video? That came out, she put it out, I think the day before or 2 days before.
I would say probably more yeses than no's.
So I'll just explain a couple of these pictures. This picture on the upper right, this is an explicit, so when she did the Super Bowl performance, this was the 50th anniversary of the founding of the Black Panther Party for social self-defense. And the Black Panthers, you might have heard about it. It's kind of famous or infamous, depending on who you talk to, in the US. It was originally founded in the San Diego area to combat police violence and provide kind of a grassroots social safety net for the poorest and blackest parts of Oakland, sorry, the Bay Area. So the poorest and blackest parts of Oakland. It came to be known as a militant protest organization. So they were known for wearing berets and for going ahead and keeping their hair in afros and wearing kind of military style garb. And so those costumes are a clear reference to the Black Panthers. And then the X down there is a reference to Malcolm X, who of course was also a really well-known activist in the US for an advocate for the rights of Black people, who is also known as being more militant. He's often wrongly contrasted with Martin Luther King Jr. Often people say Martin Luther King Jr. was nice and peaceful and Malcolm X was violent and mean, and actually they really respected each other. And both of those are overly extreme. So this happened, right, January, February 2016. And after that, Saturday Night Live did a little skit based on this. And I'm gonna show this to you. It's just a couple minutes long. I'll just show a couple minutes of it because it really kind of brings together a lot of the ideas so far. So it certainly gets the point across. What we see here is people worried about suddenly thinking this person that they saw as one of them, it turns out isn't. And there's that point where you know, my friend, I think of you as a person. I don't think of you as Black. But then of course this other guy is, which again emphasizes the way we categorize people is not just about color. It's not just about hair. It's not just about any physical attributes. It's about how we think of them. And it's ultimately about power. You know, a lot of these things aren't pretty, right? I don't actually love talking about some of these thoughts or repeating some of the things that are said, but it's important because it's examples of what race is and what race is not. And a reminder that, as we saw at the end of that little skit, categorizing people by race really quickly turns into having ideas about people who are parts of different races. The, oh, thank goodness, you know, my child is still white. Okay, so the big messages here. I think I'm about out of time, so I'll just say the big messages. How do we know who belongs to what race? Again, racial categories, they symbolize social conflicts and interests. Categories and their boundaries, they're not universal. They change over time, and they reflect social conflicts and interests, not biology. But remember that if people define situations as real, they're real in their consequences. And one of the things we've really seen this past month is how real those consequences are, and really demonstrations like we haven't seen in a long time trying to change them. So with that, I'll stop and questions.